They think I am just the stable daughter, the one who always shows up on time, brings the side dishes, and quietly fades out of every important conversation. They have no idea that 11 days before Christmas, I sold my company for $170 million. They also do not know my golden older brother has been secretly using my name as a ticket to save his own ambitions. By tonight, their years of lies will end. My name is Nancy Pierce. I am 34 years old, and I live in the quiet, frozen town of Ashby Falls, Ohio. If you were to walk into my family's home on any given holiday, you would assume I belong there. I have always been accustomed to the fact that in my house, every single room has a physical space for me. There is always a designated chair near the corner, an empty hook for my coat by the hallway door, and a plate set at the less favorable end of the dining table. But while there is always a place for my body, there is never a place for my voice. No conversation in that house truly has a space for me. My mother, Elaine Pierce, had declared weeks in advance that this year, Christmas dinner was going to be a little celebration for Gavin. Gavin is my older brother. He is the golden sun around which my parents orbit, the undisputed center of gravity in our family universe. Recently, he had been promoted to a senior role at Caldervale Advisory, a flashy financial consulting firm that dealt in moving invisible money around for very visible people. In my mother's eyes, this promotion was tantamount to being crowned royalty. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, no one bothered to call and ask if I was busy. No one asked if I was tired, or how my year had been, or if I had any news of my own to share. The entire sum of my family's interest in my existence arrived in the form of a single, highly transactional message sent to the family group chat by my mother. Remember to come early to help set the table. There was no greeting. There was no warmth. It was simply a directive, issued to the family's eternal background character. I was the reliable one, the daughter who could be counted on to carry the side dishes, fold the napkins, and disappear into the wallpaper before the important people started talking about important things. The drive to my parents' house was bitter and dark. I navigated my battered, ancient Subaru through the icy, winding roads of Ashby Falls, listening to the heater rattle and wheeze against the freezing December air. I was wearing a heavy, faded wool coat that I had already worn for 3 consecutive winters. The cuffs were slightly frayed, and the shape of it was tired, completely lacking any semblance of luxury or status. I wore it purposefully. I was driving a car that sounded like it was dying, wearing a coat that looked like it had given up, intentionally hiding any outward sign that my reality had completely shattered their entire worldview. Because exactly 11 days ago, I sat in a sleek glass-walled conference room overlooking a sprawling skyline, and I signed the final legal agreements to sell the software company I had built from absolute scratch. I sold it for $170 million. My bank account currently held a number so utterly massive, so staggeringly large, that looking at the digital balance still made my vision blur and my chest tighten. But tonight, as I gripped the freezing steering wheel of my old car, I had no intention of walking into that house to flash my wealth. I was not there to brag or demand a sudden, shallow form of respect purchased by a massive wire transfer. I was there for an entirely different reason. I was there to observe. I wanted to see exactly how my family would continue to treat me when they still firmly believed I was small, insignificant, and stagnant. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I parked my beaten Subaru behind Gavin's pristine, leased luxury sedan. I turned off the ignition, but I did not immediately open the door. I sat in the freezing silence of the cabin, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I looked at the warmly lit windows of my childhood home. I told myself, with a terrifying sort of clarity, that tonight was no longer a night about money. This was a night about memory. This was a night about the strict, unbreakable hierarchy of priorities in my family. It was a live demonstration of just how long, and how far, a child could be pushed to the absolute margins of her own bloodline. I stepped out into the freezing wind, walked up the steps, and pushed the front door open. The wave of heat, cinnamon, and roasting meat hit me instantly, accompanied by a visual tableau that was so perfectly predictable it almost felt rehearsed. My father, Martin Pierce, was leaning back in his armchair by the fireplace, roaring with laughter at some story Gavin was telling. My father's face was flushed with pure, unfiltered pride. Beside them, my mother was hovering with practiced devotion, carefully pouring Gavin a glass of the expensive, heavy red wine she knew he preferred. The Christmas tree in the corner was glowing with hundreds of bright, flashing lights, casting a warm and festive shine over the three of them. And then there was me. I closed the door softly behind me, the latch clicking shut, and for a long, heavy moment, I simply stood in the entryway. Nobody looked up. Nobody paused the story. Nobody offered me a glass, a greeting, or even a basic acknowledgement of my physical arrival. I was a ghost haunting my own family's celebration, completely and utterly invisible. I watched Gavin take a sip of his wine, his chest puffed out, holding court in a room that had been designed from his birth to act as his personal theater. My mother patted his shoulder, her eyes shining. My father chuckled, gesturing for Gavin to continue talking. I stood by the door, the frayed fabric of my 3-year-old coat heavy on my shoulders, and a thought bloomed inside my mind. It was a thought so distinctly cold, so violently sharp, that it genuinely surprised me. Tonight, I told myself, just let him do it. Just let Gavin make one more condescending remark. Let him throw one more casual, patronizing insult my way. Let my mother defend him. Let my father laugh. Let them play out this tired, pathetic script one final time. Because the second they cross that line tonight, I am going to flip this entire table of truth upside down and watch their perfect fictional reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. What they did not know, what none of them could possibly fathom as they sat there basking in the glow of Gavin's manufactured greatness, was that the $170 million was only the first bomb I had resting in my pocket. The money was merely a number. The true weapon, the secret that was currently burning a hole through my conscience, was far darker and much more destructive. Because over the past week of auditing and legal transition, my lawyers had uncovered a devastating paper trail. Gavin had not just been enjoying his new title at Caldervale Advisory. Long before I ever sat down to sign the sale of my company, long before I ever made a single public announcement about the massive success of my software platform, my golden, untouchable older brother had secretly found out about my impending fortune, and instead of congratulating me, instead of being proud, he had quietly and desperately begun leveraging my name, my reputation, and my imminent wealth as a massive, fraudulent ticket to salvage his own sinking ambitions and secure his own fragile image. I unbuttoned my old coat, the fabric rough against my fingers. I took a slow, deep breath of the cinnamon-scented air, letting the coldness inside my chest settle into a hard, unbreakable armor. I walked out of the shadows of the hallway and stepped into the blinding light of the living room, ready to serve them the holiday dinner they truly deserved. Growing up in the Pierce household was a masterclass in understanding spatial dynamics and atmospheric pressure. Gavin always occupied the absolute center, effortlessly sucking the oxygen out of every room he entered. From the moment he could walk and form coherent sentences, he was the brightest, most celebrated fixture in our home. He played varsity lacrosse, possessed a dangerously smooth way of speaking, and knew exactly how to make any adult in the room throw their head back in laughter. Every Thanksgiving dinner, every 4th of July barbecue, and every casual Sunday afternoon was seamlessly transformed into his personal stage. He would stand in the middle of the living room, recounting an exaggerated story about a tough game or a strict teacher, and my parents would watch him with a reverence usually reserved for religious deities. I, on the other hand, was the convenient child. I was the low-maintenance offspring who required zero supervision and generated zero friction. I taught myself how to study for standardized tests under the dim light of my desk lamp, while the rest of the house watched television. I drove myself to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get my license on the morning of my 16th birthday, taking the city bus there because my parents were busy attending one of Gavin's weekend sports tournaments. I filled out my own college applications, tracked my own financial aid deadlines, and reminded my parents when the tuition bills were due. Because I functioned like a quiet, well-oiled machine, I was permanently slapped with a label that would define my entire youth. My mother would wave her hand dismissively whenever her friends asked about me. "Nancy is so independent," she would say with a tight smile. "We never have to worry about that girl." Not worrying about me quickly and inevitably morphed into not thinking about me at all. The contrast in how we were handled was staggering, though it was always painted over with my parents' unique brand of middle-class Midwestern justification. When Gavin was 19 years old, he completely totaled his first car. He had been driving recklessly down Route 42, speeding in the pouring rain to get to a party, and wrapped the front end of a pristine Honda Civic around a steel guardrail. My parents did not ground him. They did not make him pay for the insurance deductible or work off the damages. They simply drained a significant portion of their savings, bought him a newer model within the week, and solemnly referred to the entire ordeal as a necessary lesson in growing up. They hugged him and told him they were just glad he was safe. A year later, when I was 20 years old, I found a specialized online certification course for advanced data analysis. It cost exactly $850. I desperately needed it to secure a competitive internship at a logistics firm. But I was short on my campus bookstore wages. I sat at the kitchen island, spread out a meticulously drafted repayment plan, and asked my parents for a small loan. My mother did not even look at the printed syllabus. She stirred her coffee, sighed heavily, and told me I should not be too ambitious with those confusing, technical things. She said it was better to stick to a safe, steady path, heavily implying that my intellect was not suited for complex systems. I ended up picking up 3 extra weekend shifts at a greasy local diner, smelling like fried oil for months, just to pay for the course myself. But the defining fracture in our family's foundation, the moment the final illusion of fairness completely evaporated, was never about $800. It was about my grandmother. When she passed away, she left me a dedicated trust fund specifically earmarked for graduate school. It was exactly $35,000. It was not a mountain of wealth, but it was enough to give me a head start. An actual fighting chance in a professional world that demanded advanced credentials. I never saw a single penny of it. When I was 24 years old, Gavin decided he was going to become a prominent real estate mogul. He bought a decaying, termite-infested property on the east side of town, absolutely convinced he could flip it in 3 months and double his initial investment. It was a spectacular, catastrophic failure. Contractors walked out due to unpaid invoices. City permits were denied because of his careless planning. And suddenly, Gavin was drowning in debt, facing potential legal action from an aggressive private lender. My parents panicked. The golden boy was facing actual consequences, and that was unacceptable. In the name of protecting the family, they quietly liquidated my graduate school fund and handed every last cent over to Gavin to bail him out of his mess. My mother sat me down in the living room, tears pooling in her eyes, and promised me it was just a temporary loan. She swore on my grandmother's memory that they would pay it back the moment things stabilized. That temporary loan stretched into 1 year, then 5 years, and then it simply became a permanent, unspoken ghost that we were never allowed to mention again. In exchange for my absolute silence regarding the stolen money, I was allowed to continue serving as the family's ultimate background utility. During every single holiday and family gathering, I was the one who remembered to buy the thoughtful anniversary gifts. I was the one who drove 40 miles in the snow to pick up our elderly aunt who could no longer drive in the dark. I managed the complex calendar for my surviving grandfather's cardiology appointments, dealing with endless insurance claim numbers and pharmacy refills. When the holiday parties ended, when the expensive wine bottles were empty and Gavin had finished regaling everyone with his grand, hollow visions of his corporate future, I was the one left standing in the kitchen. I would spend 2 hours scraping dried gravy off porcelain plates, loading the dishwasher, and tying up the heavy garbage bags while the rest of them slept peacefully upstairs. The most bitter, agonizing part of my existence was not being yelled at. I was never overtly abused, beaten, or openly hated. It was far more insidious, far more damaging than that. I was simply used. I was utilized as a foundation so impossibly reliable, so completely devoid of personal boundaries, that absolutely no one in my bloodline ever stopped to consider that I might be a human being. Nobody thought I had my own distinct needs, my own quiet ambitions, and a desperate, starving desire to simply be seen and acknowledged. Over the years, I mastered the art of swallowing my words. I learned to push the anger down deep into my stomach, locking it away behind a neutral expression. If I ever dared to express frustration, if I ever pointed out the glaring, mathematical inequity in how we were treated, the response was immediate and punishing. My mother would instantly sigh, cross her arms tightly over her chest, and tell me I was being entirely too sensitive. She would accuse me of holding grudges and ruining the family peace over nothing. Gavin, standing nearby with a fresh drink in his hand, would just flash that familiar, infuriating smirk. It was the relaxed, bulletproof smile of a natural winner who knew the game was rigged in his favor long before the referee ever blew the whistle. But growing up inside that kind of suffocating, invalidating echo chamber did not break me the way they probably assumed it had. Instead, it forced me to develop a highly dangerous set of survival instincts because I was continuously forced into the shadows. I became an exceptional observer. I watched how people moved, how they lied, and how they hid their true intentions behind polite smiles and manufactured outrage. I developed a memory like a steel trap, archiving every broken promise, every dismissed achievement, and every patronizing pat on the head. Once I finally accepted that I was never going to receive the love and validation I had been waiting for my entire life, a switch flipped inside my brain. I stopped waiting. I stopped asking for permission. I started quietly building an entire life, an entire empire, completely outside of their limited field of vision. Looking back at those years, I finally understood the core truth of my existence within that house. I was never weaker than Gavin. I was not less capable, less intelligent, or less driven. I had simply been conditioned, meticulously trained over 3 decades, to live as if my own achievements needed to be shrunk down, folded up, and hidden away. I was taught to play small so that my light would never accidentally make anyone else in my family feel uncomfortable. My days did not begin with catered executive lunches or sleek corner offices overlooking a bustling metropolitan skyline. For the better part of a decade, the sun would rise, and I would sit under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a gray cubicle at Blue Fern Mutual. I was a disaster claims operations manager for a mid-sized property insurance firm that specialized in the aftermath of major natural disasters. My daily reality was built on the wreckage of hurricanes, sudden wildfires, brutal hailstorms, and devastating flash floods. There was absolutely nothing glamorous about my profession. I spent 40 hours a week staring at a dual monitor setup, my eyes burning as I read through hundreds of pages of catastrophic damage reports. I cross-referenced convoluted policy contracts, trying to find coverage loopholes that could save a desperate homeowner from total financial ruin. But the heaviest part of the job, the part that soaked into my clothes and followed me home, was the headset. Every single day, I listened to people cry. I heard the raw, unfiltered panic in the voices of fathers who had just watched the roof of their family home cave in under the weight of a fallen oak tree. I listened to mothers sobbing from the parking lot of a discount motel, pleading to know when their temporary housing check would arrive so they could buy clean underwear for their children. These people were trapped in a terrifying, bureaucratic purgatory, caught directly in the crossfire between predatory local contractors, apathetic insurance adjusters, and massive mountains of lost paperwork. Sitting at that desk, answering those agonizing calls, I began to see a deeply ingrained, systemic sickness in the industry. The chaos was never unique. It was the exact same operational failure repeating itself thousands of times over. The critical data required to rebuild a human being's life was scattered across a disorganized wasteland of forwarded emails, blurry photographs sent via text message, disjointed voicemail transcripts, and archaic spreadsheets. There was no centralized truth. If one single field adjuster forgot to upload a mitigation invoice, or if a contractor sent an estimate to the wrong email address, the entire chain halted. That single missing link meant a displaced family might be forced to live out of suitcases in a single cramped room for an additional 6 weeks. The profound injustice of that inefficiency kept me awake at night. I realized that the insurance industry did not need another policy update. It needed a complete infrastructural revolution. That was the genesis of ClaimBridge. I envisioned a comprehensive, centralized platform designed to track every single movement of a compensation file in real time. It would have automated flags to warn adjusters about common contractor fraud schemes. It would pull the repair status, the payout ledger, and the temporary housing authorizations into one single, transparent dashboard accessible to both the insurer and the devastated homeowner. I knew the operational workflow flawlessly, but I did not know how to build the digital architecture. That was when I found Orla Bishop. Orla was a brilliant, fiercely stubborn data architect who worked in the basement IT department of Blue Fern Mutual. She survived on black coffee, possessed zero patience for corporate pleasantries, and had a mind that visualized code like a master chess player visualizes a board. When I cornered her in the break room and pitched the concept, I showed her a mock-up that was nothing more than a deeply ugly, painfully complex spreadsheet that I had color-coded by hand. Orla stared at it in silence for a long time. Then she looked at me, completely ignoring the amateur presentation, and said she could build the engine to make it breathe. For the next 3 years, I lived a grueling, split existence that no one in my immediate family could even remotely comprehend. My alarm clock went off at 4 a.m. I would spend the early hours drafting product requirement documents and mapping out user interfaces before driving to my day job. From 8 a.m. until 5 p.m, I managed real-world disaster files, dealing with the frantic calls of flood victims. Then, I would drive straight to Orla's cramped apartment. We would eat cold takeout food sitting on her floor, arguing fiercely over data integration pathways and beta testing protocols until midnight. On the weekends, while normal people rested, I was on endless video calls, running pilot programs with desperate, overwhelmed regional insurance carriers who were drowning in their own chaotic processes. It was an exhausting, isolating marathon, and I made the critical mistake of trying to share the weight of it with my family. During a Sunday afternoon dinner, shortly after Orla and I had secured our second successful beta test, I attempted to explain my vision. I wanted them to understand that I was not just pushing digital paper. I was actively building a technological lifeline designed to serve thousands of families standing in the ruins of their lives. I barely got through 3 sentences before the dismissal began. Gavin, leaning casually against the kitchen counter with a beer in his hand, let out a loud, theatrical sigh. He shook his head, flashing his trademark condescending smirk. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You are spending all your free time building a sad PDF sorting software. Good luck monetizing digital filing cabinets. Nance." I tried to defend the platform, explaining the predictive fraud algorithms and the automated payment triggers. But my mother immediately waved her hand to cut me off. The moment she heard words like software, systems, and API integration, her eyes completely glazed over. She stood up to clear the salad bowls, explicitly stating that tech jargon gave her a migraine and that we should talk about something more pleasant. My father delivered the final, crushing verdict. He looked at me from the head of the table, his expression a mixture of pity and mild annoyance. "It is a nice little hobby to keep you busy," he concluded firmly, "but you need to be realistic. That is not a real job with real money. like what Gavin is doing over at the advisory firm. Do not let this distraction ruin your steady paycheck at the insurance company. They buried my life's work under a mountain of casual contempt before they even understood what it was. But looking back, their blind arrogance was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Because nobody in my own home believed in my capability. I had absolutely no safety net to fall back on. I could not afford to be sloppy. I could not afford to rely on unearned confidence. Their dismissal stripped away any lingering desire I had for their approval, leaving behind a cold, refined discipline. I became relentlessly meticulous. I learned how to stand my ground against aggressive venture capitalists because I had spent my entire life practicing how to hold my tongue while being talked down to by arrogant men. I learned how to identify the exact breaking point in a contract negotiation because I was intimately familiar with the anatomy of a bad deal. My family had spent 3 decades training me to be invisible, completely unaware that invisibility is the ultimate advantage in a war no one knows you are fighting. They succeeded in making me a ghost in their living room. But in the process, they accidentally forged me into a relentless, untouchable force at the negotiating table. The turning point arrived late in the summer of our second year of development, courtesy of a monstrous, unprecedented hurricane season that relentlessly battered the southern coast. Regional insurance carriers were completely paralyzed, adjusters were sleeping in their vehicles, and desperate policyholders were screaming into disconnected phone lines in their utter operational desperation. A Midwestern firm with a massive southern footprint agreed to deploy the full, live version of our platform across their entire claims department. They had absolutely nothing left to lose. The results we delivered over the next 2 months were not just a mild improvement, they were absolutely seismic. Our system slashed their average processing time by 60%. The plague of lost files, the bureaucratic black holes that kept devastated families out of their homes, completely vanished overnight. More importantly, the automated red flags caught fraudulent contractor estimates before a single check was ever cut, saving the carrier millions of dollars within the first month alone. The industry immediately noticed. Word of our platform spread through the tightly knit, fiercely competitive executive circles of the insurance world like a spark on dry grass. Suddenly, Orla and I were no longer begging for 15-minute video calls with skeptical middle managers. We were fielding aggressive, high-stakes inquiries from massive corporate entities. The climax of this frantic surge came when Palisade Civic Systems, a colossal infrastructure software conglomerate, stepped directly into the arena. They did not want to license our technology. They did not want a partnership. They wanted to buy it outright, swallow it whole, and integrate it into their global ecosystem. The woman who sat at the long, polished mahogany table across from the Palisade acquisition team was not the same woman who quietly cleared plates at her family's holiday dinners. In those blindingly bright, high-stakes boardrooms, I found a terrifying, absolute stillness inside myself when their lead negotiator, a man wearing a suit that cost more than my car, leaned forward and tried to compress the valuation by using dense technical jargon to make our code seem easily replicable. I did not flinch. I held his gaze and systematically dismantled his argument line by line. I cited our proprietary architecture, our flawless integration metrics, and the raw, undeniable data we had just proven in the field. I was cold, articulate, and ruthlessly precise. I refused to let a room full of arrogant, wealthy executives discount the grueling years of my life or put a clearance tag on my intellect. When they pushed, I pushed back harder. I demanded an astronomical premium, and I held the absolute silence in the room until they finally broke and met my terms. The day the ink dried, I wore a simple, structured charcoal suit. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room high above the city, a heavy silver pen resting in my hand. As I signed my name across the final page of the heavily guarded contract, I felt a strange, detached sensation wash over me. I was watching my own signature instantly convert a lifetime of being aggressively underestimated into a financial figure that would cause my parents to stop breathing. 48 hours later, the final wire transfer cleared. I was sitting alone in the driver's seat of my rattling Subaru in the back corner of a grocery store parking lot when the notification chimed on my phone. I opened the banking application. I stared at the glowing screen for a very long time. My account balance now read exactly $170 million. I did not immediately drive to a luxury dealership to buy a sports car. I did not draft a triumphant social media post to scream my success to the world. I did not dial my parents' house to demand their sudden, terrified respect. Instead, I gripped the worn leather of my steering wheel, leaned my forehead against the cold plastic of the dashboard, and wept. I sobbed until my throat ached and my chest burned. I was not crying because I was suddenly incredibly wealthy. I was crying because, for the first time in 34 years, I finally held undeniable, legally binding proof that I was not the tiny, insignificant failure they had spent my entire life convincing me I was. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face, put the car in drive, and made a conscious, highly strategic decision to remain completely silent. I knew the psychological mechanics of my family better than I knew my own complex codebase. If I called my mother right then and revealed the staggering reality of the acquisition, she would instantly and masterfully rewrite our entire history. She would expertly manufacture a narrative where she and my father had always been my biggest champions, claiming my ultimate success was a direct result of their tough love and grounded parenting. Worse, within 24 hours, they would subtly transition the conversation toward Gavin. They would start dropping heavy, guilt-laden hints about how my sudden windfall could provide a crucial, risk-free safety net for whatever reckless, failing real estate venture my brother was currently sinking into. I absolutely refused to let them hijack my victory and mold it into a convenient financial tool for their golden boy. My resolve hardened into pure, unbreakable steel exactly 1 week before Christmas. My phone buzzed on my desk with a notification from the family group chat. My mother had sent a reminder about the upcoming holiday dinner. "Do not forget," she typed, adding a small graphic of 2 clinking champagne glasses. "We are having a little celebration for Gavin's massive promotion this year." There was no mention of my year, my health, my job, or my life. I was explicitly cast as a background extra in the ongoing, celebrated movie of my brother's existence. 5 minutes later, Gavin replied to the thread. "Yeah," he typed, his text dripping with the casual, practiced cruelty he had perfected over 3 decades. And if Nancy actually managed to make a little extra money at her depressing desk job this year, maybe she will not have to bring the discount-bagged salad this time. I sat at my desk and stared at the glowing screen. I waited for my mother to chime in, to perhaps gently reprimand him, to tell him that was an ugly thing to say. I waited for my father to type a quick message telling him to knock it off. The screen remained dark. The silence was absolute. No one defended me. No one cared. His insult was simply accepted as the natural order of our family dynamic. Right then and there, looking at that cruel, unanswered message, the final piece of my plan snapped into perfect place. I was not going to walk into their house wearing designer clothes or casually mentioning my new corporate reality. I was not going to give them the luxury of a warning. I would walk through their front door looking exactly like the defeated, stagnant, exhausted woman they firmly believed I was. I would let them set the stage. Let them run their usual patronizing script, and let them fully expose the rotting core of their favoritism. I would wait until they were absolutely comfortable in their arrogance, completely secure in their false superiority, and then, at the exact right moment, I would drop a number on their pristine dining room table that was heavy enough to crush their ancient, toxic hierarchy into absolute dust. The physical environment of my childhood home was almost exactly the same to every single holiday season I had ever endured. Nothing had changed. The slightly faded artificial pine wreath still hung crookedly on the inside of the front door. The multicolored string lights out on the front porch blinked in their familiar, erratic rhythm. The air inside the house was thick, practically suffocating, heavily perfumed with the sharp scent of ground cinnamon and the rich, savory aroma of a massive beef roast resting in the kitchen oven. To an outsider, it was a perfectly curated portrait of middle-class American holiday warmth. To me, the intense, manufactured coziness of the space felt like a direct insult, a mocking contrast to the absolute, Arctic coldness settling into my bones. As I finally stepped fully into the light of the living room, the ongoing conversation abruptly stopped. My mother, Elaine, turned toward me. She did not walk over to embrace me. She did not offer a warm holiday greeting. Instead, her eyes immediately scanned the worn fabric of my heavy winter coat and the tired lines on my face. A look of deep, practiced pity washed over her features. "Nancy," she blurted out, her voice loud enough to ensure Gavin and my father heard every word. "Are you still doing all that depressing hurricane paperwork down at the insurance office? You look completely exhausted. It really is taking a toll on you, honey." She delivered the remark with the exact tone one might use to speak to a stray dog that kept wandering back onto the porch. It was her signature move. Under the thin disguise of maternal concern, she expertly painted me as a stagnant, pitiable creature who was permanently stuck in a miserable rut. I did not defend myself. I did not explain that my exhaustion was the byproduct of closing a massive corporate acquisition. I simply offered a polite, empty smile, took off my old coat, and walked straight to the kitchen to bring out the serving dishes. When it was time to eat, the seating arrangement at the large oak dining table was a physical manifestation of our family's exact hierarchy. Gavin was placed squarely in the center of the long side of the table, sitting in the largest chair. He looked like a victorious general holding court. My father, Martin, and my mother sat directly across and adjacent to him, flanking him like two loyal deputies at a miniature award ceremony. I was assigned to the absolute furthest end of the table, seated in a slightly wobbly chair positioned right next to the swinging kitchen door. My placement was not an accident. I was seated there purely for logistical convenience. It was the perfect spot for me to easily jump up, collect empty plates, fetch more dinner rolls, and refill the water pitchers without interrupting the important flow of conversation happening at the center. As soon as the wine was poured, my father tapped his crystal glass with a silver butter knife. He cleared his throat, puffing out his chest as he looked at my brother. "I want to make a toast," my father announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. "To Gavin. This year has been nothing short of spectacular for you. Son, Caldervale Advisory is lucky to have you. We are looking at a very big future here. Huge clients, major market influence. You are firmly on the partner track now, and your mother and I could not possibly be more proud of the man you have become." My mother practically glowed. She raised her expensive wine glass, gazing at Gavin with a level of pure, unfiltered adoration that she had never once directed toward me in my entire 34 years of life. They all clanked their glasses together over the center of the table. I sat quietly at my end, holding a glass of tap water, watching the performance unfold. After a solid 20 minutes of dissecting Gavin's new corporate title, his corner office view, and his supposedly brilliant financial strategies, the conversation inevitably hit a lull. It was at this precise moment that my mother seemed to remember I was also sitting at the table. She turned her head toward me, a piece of roast beef hovering on her fork. "So, what about you, Nancy?" she asked. The question was entirely perfunctory, completely devoid of any genuine curiosity. "Still the same old job, still dealing with all those angry people on the phone." Before I could even open my mouth to form a polite, non-committal answer, Gavin leaned back in his chair. He swirled the heavy red wine in his glass, looking down his nose at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn into solid ice. "You know, Nancy, if you are finally getting tired of your boring little desk job, I might be able to help you out," Gavin said, his voice dripping with spectacular arrogance. "With my new position at the firm, I have a lot of pull. I could easily talk to human resources and get you a decent administrative assistant position at my company. You know, answering phones, organizing files. It would be a nice step up for you. Better pay. Definitely better scenery than whatever basement you are working in now. The entire table went silent, waiting for my grateful response to his incredible generosity. My mother nodded approvingly, clearly thrilled that her successful son was offering to throw scraps to his struggling sister. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single trace of emotion cross my face. I simply picked up my silver dinner fork and laid it gently across the edge of my porcelain plate. The soft clink of the metal against the dish was the only sound in the room. I looked directly into Gavin's eyes. My calmness was absolute, and it instantly caused the warm, festive atmosphere in the room to plummet into something deeply uncomfortable. "Thank you for the offer, Gavin," I said, my voice completely flat and perfectly steady. "But I no longer have to worry about making money from my company. I already sold it." Gavin blinked. The smug smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second before he forcefully plastered it back on. He let out a loud, harsh bark of a laugh, looking at my parents as if I had just told a pathetic joke. "Right," Gavin scoffed, shaking his head with aggressive disbelief. "Your little disaster software project. I completely forgot about that. Okay, I will bite. How much did that pointless little company actually sell for $10,000? 20. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not blink. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the dining table. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. $170 million, I said. The words did not echo. They dropped onto the wooden table like heavy, lead weights. The reaction was entirely physical, a series of sharp, uncontrolled movements that happened simultaneously. The stem of the wine glass in my mother's hand suddenly jerked, splashing a dark red stain across the pristine white table linen as her hand completely froze in midair. My father's fingers went slack, and his heavy silver meat fork clattered loudly onto his plate, sliding off the ceramic edge and hitting the wooden table with a sharp thud. Gavin's condescending laugh stretched out for exactly 1 second longer before it died violently in his throat. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. Nobody spoke. The silence that followed was not merely quiet, it was a pressurized, suffocating vacuum. To ensure the reality of the situation completely destroyed whatever denial their brains were frantically trying to construct. I calmly reached into my pocket. I pulled out my phone, unlocked the screen, and opened the primary banking application. I navigated to the main account overview. I did not say another word. I simply placed the phone face up in the direct center of the dining table, sliding it forward until it rested right next to the gravy boat, perfectly visible to all three of them. The bright digital screen illuminated the dark wood of the table. They all leaned forward, almost involuntarily, their eyes locking onto the glowing white text. There, displayed in crisp, undeniable numbers, was the massive, 9-figure balance. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof that this was not a desperate lie, not a pathetic cry for attention, and absolutely not a joke. The bomb had successfully detonated, and I sat perfectly still in the dead center of the blast radius, watching the shockwaves shatter their perfect, fictional world. The glowing screen of my phone sat in the center of the dining table, casting a harsh white light over the spilled red wine. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator. I watched my family process the undeniable truth staring back at them. The numbers were absolute. My mother was the first to break the suffocating silence. I expected shock. I expected a barrage of frantic questions. I even expected a sudden, hypocritical embrace. I received none of those things. Instead, Elaine Pierce grabbed her linen napkin, aggressively dabbed at the wine stain, and looked at me with an expression of profound irritation. "Nancy, really?" she snapped, her voice trembling not with awe, but with sharp annoyance. "Bringing up money at the dinner table. Why would you do something so crass just to ruin the mood of the evening?" We were having such a lovely time celebrating your brother." It was a breathtaking display of emotional gymnastics in her mind. The core issue was not that her daughter had just achieved something monumental, nor was it the fact that they had spent the entire evening treating me like a glorified servant. The true crime was that my sudden revelation was a direct inconvenience to the aesthetic of her perfect holiday dinner. My father finally found his voice. He did not look at the phone anymore. He looked at me, his face hardening into a rigid mask of offended authority. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim the patriarchal high ground he felt slipping through his fingers. "If this is actually true," Martin demanded, his tone heavy with righteous indignation, "why did you not inform your mother and me first? We are your parents. We have a right to know what is happening under our own roof before you drop something like this on us out of nowhere." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my throat. It was not a joyful sound. It was the sound of 3 decades of suppressed frustration finally snapping. "I should have informed you first," I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Do you remember 3 years ago, when I sat at this exact table and asked you to co-sign a small business credit line for $15,000, I needed it to keep my servers running? Do you remember what you told me?" "Dad, you told me not to throw my future away on something vague and pointless. You told me to focus on my little desk job. You did not want to be involved when I was struggling, so you do not get to demand a front row seat now that I have won." Gavin, who had been staring blankly at the wall, suddenly slammed his hand against the wood. The silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. "This is a joke," Gavin sneered, though the panic in his eyes completely betrayed his aggressive tone. "Show me the routing numbers. Show me the legal acquisition documents. Anyone can fake a screenshot on their phone." I did not move. I just stared at him, letting him drown in his own denial. It only took him a few more seconds of looking at my unwavering expression to realize it was entirely real. And the moment the reality sank in, his panic immediately shifted from disbelief to absolute narcissistic terror. "Wait," Gavin stammered, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. "If this gets out, what is everyone at my firm going to think I just got promoted? I am dealing with high-level clients. If the partners find out my little sister orchestrated a massive corporate buyout, and I had absolutely no idea, I am going to look like a complete idiot. Why would you hide this from me? You are making me look incompetent." The sheer audacity of his reaction was the final catalyst. I stood up from my chair. I did not yell, but the sheer force of my words pinned them all to their seats. I finally unleashed every single truth I'd been forced to swallow to keep their fragile peace. "I am making you look incompetent," I asked, my voice ringing clear and hard across the room. "You have spent your entire life stepping on my neck to make yourself look taller. Do not talk to me about hiding things. You took my graduate school fund to save your own disastrous investments, and nobody said a word. I built an entire platform from scratch, and my achievements were constantly ignored. Every single time I tried to share a story about my life, one of you would cut me off just to pivot the conversation back to Gavin's glorious future. I did not hide my success from you. You simply refused to look in my direction." My mother's face crumpled. Genuine tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, streaking down her cheeks. "Nancy, please," she sobbed, clutching her napkin to her chest. "We did not know. We honestly did not know things were that serious for you." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy finality. I aimed my words directly at the sorest, most undeniable wound in our family history. "You did not know," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "because you never stayed long enough to listen." Gavin sprang from his chair, the wooden legs screeching violently against the hardwood floor. He was furious, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "You planned this?" Gavin shouted. "You chose exactly tonight, my night, just to humiliate me. You wanted to destroy my celebration because you are jealous." I picked up my phone from the table and slid it back into my coat pocket. If my mere existence as a successful person feels like a physical attack on you, Gavin, then the problem is not me. The problem is the way this family divided its respect from the very beginning. You are only humiliated because your entire sense of self-worth relies on me being beneath you. I turned away from the table and walked calmly toward the front door. My father called out my name, his voice a mixture of anger and sudden, desperate panic. But I did not stop. I reached for the doorknob, but before I turned it, I looked over my shoulder one last time. I needed to establish the first unbreakable boundary of my new life. From this exact second forward, I told them, my voice echoing in the silent hallway. The rules have changed. If any of you want to be a part of my life, you do not get to walk in just because we share the same blood. You do not get automatic access. If you want a seat at my table, you will earn it through respect. You will never, ever treat me like an afterthought again. I opened the door and stepped out into the freezing winter night. The cold air hit my face like a physical blow, but it felt incredibly clean. I walked down the driveway, my boots crunching softly against the frost-covered concrete. I reached my old car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finally starting to recede, leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion. Before I could start the engine, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out, the screen illuminating the dark cabin of the car. It was a text message from a cousin who lived 2 states away. She had sent a screenshot with a single question mark attached to it. I opened the image. It was a screenshot of Gavin's social media story, posted less than 3 minutes ago. The picture was a vague, blurry shot of his expensive wine glass resting on the dining table. The caption underneath it, typed in bold, confident letters, read, "Big family moves. Coming soon. Huge backing. The empire is growing." I sat in the freezing darkness of my car, the phone glowing in my hand. A deep, terrifying chill ran down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter weather. He was not sorry. He was not humbled. He had not absorbed a single word I said. Before my parents could even dry their tears, before my car had even left their driveway, Gavin was already pivoting. He was already finding a way to spin my brutal confrontation into a vague, implied promise of financial backing for his own network. He was already trying to leverage my name and my capital. The war was not over. It was just changing its shape, and the next battle was going to be infinitely dirtier than a ruined holiday dinner. For exactly 14 days, following that explosive Christmas dinner, my world became a barren wasteland of absolute silence. There were no cheerful text messages wishing me a happy new year when the clock struck midnight. There were no forwarded pictures of the neighbors' pets from my mother. There was no awkward, stumbling voicemail from my father attempting to apologize or bridge the massive, jagged chasm I had ripped open in the center of their home. And entirely predictably, there was nothing but a cold, heavy void from Gavin. My family had collectively decided to employ their favorite, most historically effective weapon against me, the silent treatment. In the past, this calculated withdrawal of affection would have sent me spiraling into a desperate panic, twisting myself into agonizing knots as I tried to figure out how to make them comfortable again. But this time, sitting in the quiet of my own home, the silence did not feel like a punishment. It felt like a massive oxygen-rich exhalation. I channeled every single ounce of my lingering adrenaline into the transition of my company. My days were entirely consumed by high-level integration meetings with the Palisade Civic Systems corporate team. I sat in sleek, glass-walled boardrooms with top-tier legal departments, meticulously mapping out the structural expansion of my software platform across their national grid. I was functioning at the absolute peak of my professional capacity, completely insulated by the sheer velocity of my work. Concurrently, I finally scheduled something I should have done a decade ago. I began sitting down in a quiet, softly lit office twice a week with a licensed therapist. For 50 minutes at a time, I started the grueling, agonizing work of peeling back the thick, calcified layers of childhood trauma. I was learning how to articulate the specific, lingering damage of being raised as a convenient utility rather than a cherished daughter. I was actively building psychological armor that could no longer be pierced by passive-aggressive guilt trips. Then, on the second Tuesday of January, the screen of my phone lit up with my father's contact name. I stared at it as it vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. I knew instantly, with a cold certainty in my gut, that he was not calling to say he was wrong. Martin Pierce did not do accountability. I took a deep, steadying breath, centered my posture, and answered the call. His voice came through the speaker sounding uncharacteristically thin and incredibly fragile, completely lacking the booming, patriarchal confidence he usually wielded like a heavy club. He started with awkward, agonizing small talk about the harsh winter frost, which I let hang in the air with dead silence until he was physically forced to get to the point. He cleared his throat loudly and softly stated that the family was hitting a rough patch, and they desperately needed a temporary financial assist. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask how the corporate transition was going. He immediately launched into a frantic, convoluted explanation about Gavin's newest real estate venture. For the better part of a year, Gavin had been bragging endlessly about Briar Glen, a so-called boutique resort development on the edge of the county that he claimed was going to catapult him into a completely different wealth bracket. What my father finally confessed, his voice trembling slightly with shame, was that Gavin had severely miscalculated the initial construction costs and the local zoning permits. The primary commercial lenders were threatening to pull their funding entirely, and to keep his Golden Boys project afloat. My parents had secretly taken out a massive secondary mortgage on their own home. They had used the house I grew up in as collateral to legally guarantee Gavin's failing ambition. Now, the heavy monthly payments were due, the construction site was stalled, and they were teetering dangerously on the edge of losing absolutely everything. "We just need you to help us cross a bridge, Nancy," my father pleaded, the raw desperation leaking through his carefully chosen words. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue. You have more than enough now to make this go away." I heard a sharp rustling in the background, and then my mother's voice chimed in on the speakerphone, thick with manufactured, weeping emotion. "Family has to support each other in hard times. Sweetheart, that is what families do. We have to protect your brother's reputation before this ruins his career at the advisory firm." I sat in my expensive office chair and closed my eyes. The sheer, blinding hypocrisy of her statement actually made my chest physically ache. Nobody had ever mentioned supporting me during the grueling years I spent building my company. Nobody had protected my reputation when I was eating cold rice in a tiny apartment, terrified of missing my server hosting payments. They had explicitly told me not to throw my life away on a foolish dream. I refused to snap. I refused to yell or cry or give them the emotional reaction they were banking on. I leaned entirely into the cold, calculated executive persona that had built my empire. "I am not writing a blank check based on a panicked phone call," I told them, my voice perfectly even and devoid of any warmth. "If you want me to even consider stepping into this financial mess, you will treat me exactly like a bank. I want the complete loan origination documents. I want the signed investment commitments, the contractor invoices, and the projected cash flow statements for the next 12 months. Send every single piece of paper to my legal team." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. I heard Gavin shouting in the background, his voice muffled but undeniably furious. He violently grabbed the phone from my father. "Are you insane?" Gavin spat into the receiver, his tone dripping with absolute, toxic venom. "We are your family, Nancy. You do not treat us like an auditor. We are asking for a simple bridge loan from your own blood, and you are demanding corporate paperwork. Stop trying to punish me just because you finally got lucky." I did not offer a single word of rebuttal. I simply took the phone away from my ear and pressed the button to end the call. I refused to negotiate with a drowning man who was actively trying to pull me under while simultaneously insulting the boat I had built. I assumed that was the end of the immediate crisis. I assumed they would scramble, find another predatory lender, or finally be forced to face the devastating legal consequences of their own reckless favoritism. I was entirely wrong. The situation was no longer just a tragic, exhausting family drama. It was rapidly mutating into a very real, very dirty financial threat. Late that same evening, as I was reviewing user integration metrics on my laptop, a new email arrived in my secure inbox. The sender was the senior legal counsel at Palisade Civic Systems. The subject line was flagged with bright red, high-importance markers. The email contained a forwarded message from a prominent regional venture capitalist who occasionally worked with Palisade. Attached to the message was a heavily designed, 15-page digital pitch deck for the Briar Glen development project. The Palisade lawyer kept her message brief, simply asking if I was officially affiliated with this real estate project, noting that my name and recent financial status had been explicitly leveraged to secure secondary funding. My blood ran completely ice cold. I downloaded the digital presentation and opened it. I scrolled past the architectural renderings and the inflated revenue projections. There, on the 7th page, directly under the project's financial backing section, Gavin had brazenly listed my recent corporate acquisition. He did not explicitly forge my signature on any binding documents, but the language in the presentation was deliberately and dangerously manipulative. He strongly implied to external, high-net-worth investors that his sister, who had just experienced a massive, highly publicized liquidity event, was serving as a silent financial backer and safety net for the Briar Glen resort. He was not just begging our parents for money behind closed doors. Gavin had actively weaponized my name, my hard-earned reputation, and my new corporate status to falsely prop up a crumbling, toxic deal in the open market. He was playing a dangerous game of financial smoke and mirrors, legally implicating me in his own fraudulent mess. I sat in the dark of my living room, the glaring white light of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes. The final, devastating truth clicked into place with the heavy, metallic finality of a prison door slamming shut. I had foolishly thought that walking away on Christmas night would finally force them to respect my boundaries. I had thought that seeing the massive, undeniable number in my bank account would finally force them to recognize my worth as a competent, intelligent human being. But the $170 million did not make them see me any better. It did not magically transform me into a daughter or a sister they actually loved and respected. It only stripped away the last remaining shreds of their decency. They did not look at me and see a successful woman who had conquered her industry. They looked at me and saw nothing but a massive, incredibly convenient life raft. And they were completely willing to drown me in their own fraudulent lies if it meant keeping the golden sun afloat. I did not reply to the email from the corporate legal team right away. Panic is a luxury I could no longer afford, and acting on pure emotion was exactly what my family expected me to do. Instead, the very next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Mara Ellison, a ruthless corporate litigator who specialized in complex financial disputes. The second was to Seth Vale, a forensic auditor whose entire career was built on dragging invisible, dirty money out into the broad daylight. I hired them both on a permanent retainer. I sat in Mara's pristine, steel and glass downtown office and gave them a singular, crystal-clear directive: find out exactly how deep my brother had buried his hands into my name, my reputation, and my assets. It took Seth exactly 48 hours to completely map out the fraudulent ecosystem Gavin had constructed. Sitting across from me at a massive conference table, Seth slid a thick black folder toward me. They walked me through the wreckage piece by piece. There were dozens of emails, multiple iterations of the Briar Glen investment pitch deck, and long, damning chains of text messages with private equity partners. In every single communication thread, Gavin had explicitly and repeatedly stated that his sister, the brilliant founder of Claimbridge, was highly likely to inject massive liquidity into his real estate project the exact moment her corporate acquisition was finalized. He had spent the last 6 months essentially writing massive checks with my reputation, stringing along aggressive investors with the quiet, implied promise of my new fortune. But the fraudulent pitch decks were not the worst of it. The truly sickening revelation, the one that made the blood freeze in my veins, came when Seth started pulling decades of public property records and cross-referencing them with my parents' private banking history. He uncovered a paper trail regarding a sprawling piece of land that had belonged to my maternal grandmother, June Mercer. When she passed away many years ago, that land was sold to a commercial developer. According to the strict legal parameters of her will, the proceeds from that sale were meant to be divided equally between Gavin and me. I had always suspected the math did not add up back then. But I was young, exhausted, and deeply conditioned never to question the financial mechanics of the house. Seth proved my oldest, quietest suspicion was entirely correct. Every single cent from that land sale, including my legally mandated half, had been quietly funneled by my parents into a shell liability company. They used my inheritance to quietly settle a massive debt from one of Gavin's previous catastrophic commercial failures. Sitting in the cold air conditioning of the law office, I vividly remembered the exact conversation with my mother from that year. She had cornered me in the kitchen while I was washing dishes, her voice dripping with a heavy, artificial sweetness. She had patted my arm and promised me that the family would balance everything out later, claiming the money was just tied up in confusing estate taxes, but because I was the convenient, quiet child. Because I did not scream, throw a violent tantrum, or threaten to sue my own parents. That promise simply evaporated into the walls of the house. Staring at the heavily highlighted audit reports resting on the glass table, a profound and horrifying realization washed over me. The massive explosion at our Christmas dinner was not the actual origin of this rot. That night was merely a harsh, blinding spotlight illuminating a twisted, parasitic system that had been actively siphoning my worth for more than 10 years. I was not just being ignored while Gavin was celebrated. I was being actively harvested so that Gavin could survive his own incompetence. My initial instinct was pure, unfiltered rage. I wanted to scan the entire forensic audit and post it on every public platform available. I wanted to blast the fraudulent pitch decks to every single senior partner at Gavin's financial advisory firm and watch his meticulously crafted corporate image burn to the ground. But that evening, as I paced the hardwood floor of my apartment like a caged animal, Orla Bishop stopped me. She had driven over the moment I called her, and she sat on my sofa, watching my frantic pacing with her usual calm, analytical gaze. She told me to drop the emotional retaliation immediately. "You cannot fight him with noise, Nancy." Orla warned me, her voice steady and grounding. "Gavin is a professional, highly trained victim. If you attack him publicly and impulsively, he will expertly spin the narrative. He will cry to his network about his cruel, vindictive, newly wealthy sister who is using her massive fortune to crush his small business out of petty childhood jealousy. The only thing that can permanently sever his oxygen supply is the absolute, perfectly sequenced truth. You have to trap him in a corner where his charisma cannot save him." She was entirely right. So, I stopped pacing, and I became a cold, meticulous curator of my own betrayal. I spent the next 4 days compiling a massive, heavily indexed physical binder. I printed the original inheritance routing numbers, the property deeds, the fraudulent investment emails, the secondary mortgage documents my parents had signed, the screenshot of his ridiculous, boastful social media story, and even the condescending family group chat logs. I gathered every tiny, sharp piece of evidence that proved a long, undeniable pattern of financial and emotional bias. I built an impenetrable, legally sound fortress of truth. During this period of intense, quiet preparation, my personal phone rang constantly. My parents left dozens of tearful, agonizing voicemails and sent long paragraphs of desperate text messages. They begged for a private coffee meeting. They claimed they were completely heartbroken. stating they were so incredibly embarrassed and never expected things to go this far. They pleaded with me to sit down with them so we could handle this quietly, as a family. But I was completely done functioning within their definition of a family. I no longer believed in any apology that did not come attached to a notarized signature and a legally binding admission of guilt. I ignored every single plea for private absolution. Eventually, the pressure from the actual commercial lenders reached an absolute boiling point. The private equity partners and the primary bank holding the Briar Glen construction loan demanded a formal, in-person sit-down to clarify the sudden, terrifying confusion regarding my supposed financial backing. Gavin and my parents were backed entirely against a wall. They desperately needed me in that room to smooth things over, to smile for the bankers, and to play the familiar role of the reluctant but ultimately loyal sister who would sign a check to save the family name. They sent me a formal invitation to the meeting. I replied with a single sentence, confirming I would be there on Friday afternoon. As I packed my heavy binder into my leather briefcase on the morning of the meeting, I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. My parents and my brother firmly believed I was coming to the financial firm to throw them a lifeline. They thought I would capitulate, just like I always did, to preserve the fragile illusion of our family unit. But they were gravely mistaken. I was not walking into that conference room as their savior. I was walking in as the executioner of their lies, entirely prepared to put a permanent, devastating end to the system that had kept me buried for 34 years. The meeting took place on a bitter, overcast Friday afternoon in the neutral territory of a massive commercial lending firm in downtown Columbus. The boardroom was a sterile, intimidating cavern of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished chrome, and dark mahogany. It was a room designed specifically for high-stakes ultimatums, completely devoid of any familial warmth. I walked through the double-glass doors precisely on time, accompanied by my legal counsel, Mara Ellison. I did not dress to intimidate, nor did I dress to play the part of a wealthy eccentric. I wore a simple, sharply tailored navy blazer, dark trousers, and sensible flat shoes. My lack of ostentatious display deeply unsettled Gavin. He was entirely prepared to fight an emotional, vindictive sister throwing a sudden temper tantrum. He was absolutely not prepared to face a calm, disciplined executive flanked by a ruthless corporate litigator. Gavin was already seated at the head of the long table, desperate to establish dominance over the physical space. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. Every single hair was perfectly in place. He was projecting the aggressive, manufactured confidence of a man who firmly believed he could charm his way out of a burning building. Next to him sat our parents, Martin and Elaine. The physical toll of the last few weeks was staggering. They both looked like they had aged an entire decade. Their shoulders were slumped, their faces were pale and drawn, and they refused to make eye contact with me as I sat down directly across from them. At the opposite end of the table sat the senior loan officer representing the bank, flanked by a pair of private equity investors whom Gavin had aggressively lured into his Briar Glen development project. The moment the door clicked shut, Gavin immediately seized control of the conversation. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and delivered an opening monologue that was a masterful, nauseating blend of half-truths and blatant manipulation. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Gavin began, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with practiced sincerity. "I know there has been some unfortunate confusion regarding the capital structure of this project. Family dynamics can be incredibly complicated. Our parents and I have always sacrificed everything to give Nancy the safe space she needed to build her little software projects. When she recently finalized the sale of her company, there was a deeply understood, albeit unspoken, mutual agreement that she would step in to provide the necessary liquidity for Briar Glen. Her sudden refusal to participate today is nothing more than a highly emotional, punitive reaction to an old family disagreement." He actually paused, placing a hand over his heart, looking at the investors with a perfectly calibrated expression of brotherly sorrow. Then, He delivered the most breathtakingly arrogant lie of my entire life. To be completely honest with all of you, Gavin continued, flashing a humble, self-deprecating smile. I spent years teaching Nancy how to think big commercially. I mentored her. Her recent success in the tech sector is certainly not detached from the business acumen she absorbed while watching me navigate the financial advisory world. I am proud of her, even if she is currently acting out. I felt Mara shift slightly in the chair next to me, her posture tensing at the sheer audacity of his statement, but I did not react. I did not cut him off. I did not raise my voice in protest, nor did I slam my fist against the mahogany table. I simply sat back in my leather chair, rested my hands quietly in my lap, and let him talk. I let him speak for 15 uninterrupted minutes. I afforded him every opportunity to engineer his own absolute downfall. My goal was for all the specialists in attendance to see the true nature of my brother, once he became thoroughly convinced that he possessed the sharpest mind among us. When Gavin finally finished his speech and took his seat, wearing a smug, victorious expression, a heavy silence fell over the boardroom. The investors looked at me, clearly expecting a tearful breakdown, a frantic defense, or a capitulation. I unlatched the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. I did not look at Gavin, and I did not look at my parents. I locked eyes directly with the senior loan officer. I am not here today to debate my childhood, nor am I here to entertain my brother's creative fictional narratives, I stated, my voice completely flat and echoing loudly against the glass walls. I am here strictly to clarify my legal and financial relationship to the Briar Glen development project, which is absolutely zero. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the heavy, indexed binder Seth Vale had prepared. I opened it and methodically began placing individual documents onto the center of the table, arranging them in perfect chronological order. This first document, I said, sliding a bank transfer record across the polished wood, is an inheritance routing form from over 10 years ago. It proves that my legally mandated half of my grandmother's estate was secretly diverted into a shell liability company to cover a massive deficit from one of Gavin's previous failed real estate ventures. This establishes the historical systemic baseline of his financial entitlement regarding my assets. Gavin's smug smile instantly vanished. Nancy, what on earth are you doing? He hissed, his voice dropping its smooth cadence. I completely ignored him. I pulled out the second document. This is the secondary mortgage deed that Martin and Elaine Pierce recently executed, secretly leveraging their primary residence to guarantee the initial construction phase of Briar Glen. My mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp, burying her face in her hands. I laid down the third piece of evidence, pushing it directly toward the two private equity investors. This is a copy of the 15-page investment pitch deck that Gavin circulated to your offices exactly 3 weeks ago. If you turn to page 7, you will see that he explicitly lists my recent corporate acquisition, by name, as a guaranteed financial safety net for his potential cost overruns. I placed the fourth document down. These are the printed email chains between Gavin and the primary lending department, heavily implying my imminent financial backing to secure an extension on his credit line. Finally, I placed a printed log of text messages on the very top of the pile. And these are the direct messages from 2 weeks ago, proving unequivocally that I explicitly denied him any funding, demanded formal financial auditing, and categorically refused to participate in his venture, days before he sent that fraudulent pitch deck to your firms. The atmospheric shift in the boardroom was violent, absolute, and immediate. The two private equity investors stared down at the documents, their faces draining of color before rapidly flushing a furious, dark red. The senior loan officer snatched the pitch deck off the table, his eyes darting frantically across the highlighted text. When he finally looked up at Gavin, his expression was completely devoid of any previous professional courtesy. The warmth was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating glare of an institutional risk manager who had just realized he was sitting across from a massive liability. Mr. Pierce, the loan officer said, his voice dropping into a dangerously low register. Did you, or did you not, have a legally binding, secured financial commitment from your sister when you submitted these supplementary materials to our underwriting department? The pristine, controlled facade shattered completely. Gavin transitioned from an arrogant, poised professional to a cornered, unhinged animal in a matter of seconds. He sprang up from his leather chair, knocking it backwards so forcefully it slammed against the glass wall. "You are doing this on purpose," Gavin screamed, his face contorted with rage, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "You are deliberately trying to destroy me. You set this whole thing up just to ruin my career because you cannot stand the fact that I am the one they actually care about. You are ruining my life." I did not stand up. I did not flinch. I looked up at his red, sweating face, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt a profound, untouchable sense of peace. He had absolutely nothing left to hurt me with. "I am not destroying you, Gavin," I replied, delivering the sharpest, most definitive strike of the entire ordeal. "The truth just walked into the room. That is all." The senior loan officer raised his hand sharply, signaling an immediate and non-negotiable end to the screaming match. He ignored Gavin completely and leaned forward over the table, his eyes locking directly onto my father, Martin, who was staring at the pile of documents in absolute, paralyzed shock. "Let me be incredibly clear about what is happening right now," the loan officer stated, his tone carrying the heavy, crushing weight of severe legal consequences. "If there is any element of deliberate misrepresentation in these documents designed to influence a commercial credit decision, the fallout will extend far beyond a petty family dispute. That constitutes federal bank fraud." The room went dead silent. The loan officer kept his eyes pinned on my father. "Martin, you personally co-signed these initial financial guarantees," the loan officer demanded, his voice echoing like a judge reading a final sentence. "I need an answer right this second. Were you aware that your son was falsifying his capital backing when you signed those papers?" The air in the room completely stalled. My parents were finally pushed into the ultimate, inescapable corner, forced to make the most devastating choice of their lives right in front of me. They had to decide in that exact moment whether they would continue to lie and blindly cover for Gavin, risking their own freedom and their home, or if they would finally, for the first time in 34 years, speak the truth. The suffocating silence stretched across the boardroom, thick and heavy enough to crack the glass walls. The senior loan officer kept his unwavering, predatory gaze locked directly on my father. The two private equity investors had already begun aggressively shoving their documents back into their leather briefcases, their body language broadcasting an absolute, immediate withdrawal from the toxic deal. For 34 years, Martin Pierce had projected an image of unbreakable, patriarchal authority. I watched that entire carefully constructed persona physically disintegrate in a matter of seconds. His broad shoulders violently slumped forward, his chest caved inward, and he lowered his head until he was staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual booming arrogance. "No," my father whispered, the single syllable raspy and broken. He cleared his throat, unable to look at me, unable to look at the bankers. "No, there was no commitment. Nancy never promised us a single penny. She explicitly told us she would not participate. We knew Gavin was using her name to secure the extension, and we allowed it to happen." He swallowed hard, the sheer weight of his admission crushing the last remaining breath out of Gavin's lungs. "We spent years treating Gavin like he was the only future that mattered," my father continued, his voice trembling with a shameful, belated realization. "And we treated Nancy's success, her money, her entire life, as nothing more than a backup asset, a contingency plan to fix his mistakes." Beside him, my mother completely broke down. This was not the calculated, manipulative weeping she usually employed to avoid accountability or to make herself the victim. These were the ugly, agonizing tears of a woman who was finally being forced to look at the monstrous reality of her own parenting. Elaine buried her face in her trembling hands, her words spilling out in a jagged, breathless confession. "I am so sorry," she sobbed, her voice echoing painfully in the stark room. "I raised your brother as my ultimate pride project, Nancy. I wanted him to be perfect so badly, and I raised you to be the one who quietly cleaned up all the consequences. I used you to absorb the shock of his failures, and I had the absolute nerve to call that love. It was not love. It was convenience." Gavin stared at them in sheer, unadulterated horror. For the first time in his entire existence, his parents were not rushing to bend the fabric of reality to cushion his fall. They were not covering for him. They were actively surrendering. To prevent the commercial lenders from immediately escalating the situation into a federal criminal investigation, swift and brutal legal concessions had to be made right there at the table. My lawyer, Mara, produced a pre-drafted, legally binding affidavit. It explicitly stated, under penalty of perjury, that I had absolutely zero financial, legal, or advisory involvement in the Briar Glen project, and that any previous implications of my backing were entirely fabricated. My parents signed it with shaking hands, to cover the immediate, catastrophic margin call that the bank was now enforcing. My parents formally agreed to liquidate a private lakeside vacation property they had owned for 15 years, completely restructuring their own retirement debt instead of using my life as their personal life raft. I did not immediately withdraw my own civil complaint out of some sudden, soft-hearted gesture of familial pity. I firmly refused to let them off the hook entirely. I leaned forward and told them I would only agree to halt further legal action on one strict condition: the stolen inheritance money from the sale of my grandmother's land. The funds they had quietly siphoned away a decade ago had to be formally legally recognized. They signed a binding promissory note right there in the boardroom, converting their secret theft into a legitimate, heavily documented financial obligation. I did not need the money, but I demanded the paper trail. I demanded the undeniable, legal proof that they owed me, watching the documents being notarized. Gavin completely lost his grip on sanity. He realized his entire empire of smoke and mirrors had just evaporated. The private equity investors formally verbally withdrew their capital right there in the room, citing gross misrepresentation. The bank officer notified him that the credit extension was denied and the remaining loans were being called in. Gavin started shouting, slamming his fists against the table, accusing our parents of betraying him and accusing me of orchestrating a masterclass in cruelty. But I did not crush him to satisfy a need for petty revenge. I simply sat there, watching him flail. My ultimate victory was not found in actively destroying him. It was found in my absolute refusal to save him. I refused to be his accomplice. I refused to continue paying the excruciating physical and emotional price for his blind arrogance. I let the natural consequences of his own mediocrity finally wash over him. Within 2 weeks, the scandal of his fraudulent pitch decks reached the upper management at Calder Vale Advisory. His highly anticipated promotion was permanently revoked. His client roster was quietly reassigned, and his brilliant corporate trajectory came to a humiliating, grinding halt. As for my own wealth, I made a decision that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply painful. I took a significant portion of my acquisition payout and established a massive charitable trust. I named it the June Mercer Housing Recovery Fund. I took the legacy of the grandmother whose final gift to me had been stolen, and I transformed it into a mechanism that actually saved people. The fund was specifically designed to provide immediate, no-strings-attached financial grants and temporary housing assistance to families who were trapped in the chaotic, bureaucratic nightmare of disaster insurance claims. I took the exact pain of my past and weaponized it into an instrument of profound healing. Before I left that boardroom in Columbus, I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and looked down at my parents one final time. I set the ultimate, unbreakable boundary for the rest of my life. If you ever want to hold a place in my life again, I told them, my voice calm but laced with absolute iron. You will earn it through consistent, unwavering action. You will never ask me for a single dollar. You will never use my name to open a door. You will never again try to use my achievements to patch up Gavin's shattered honor. And you will never, ever look at my intellect, my career, or my existence as secondary. You will treat me with respect, or you will not see me at all. 1 year later, the holiday season arrived with a quiet, beautiful grace. I did not drive an old car to a house where I was treated like a ghost. Instead, I hosted Christmas dinner in the massive, warmly lit dining room of my own new home. The air smelled of fresh pine, roasting herbs, and expensive wood smoke. Orla Bishop sat at my right hand, arguing passionately about software architecture with a few of my closest, most trusted colleagues. The laughter in the room was genuine, loud, and incredibly safe. At the far end of my long dining table, there was a single, empty chair. It was not a symbol of mourning or a monument to my absent parents. It was a promise. It was an open seat reserved only for those who truly wanted to walk into my life with genuine kindness, absolute honesty, and unshakable respect. As I raised my glass to toast the family I had chosen to build, I realized the deepest knot in my chest had finally untangled itself. The peace I felt did not come from my biological family magically fixing themselves. The peace came because, after 34 years of waiting in the shadows, I had finally stopped asking for their permission to exist. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.